today Sami AlBanna, who is a lifelong Arab solidarity activist who is originally from Iraq. He's been involved in the fights for social justice, liberation, democracy, for 50 plus years now. He's here to speak, and he's been following the events in Egypt and the Middle East closely. So he's here to speak to us tonight. And to start off with, Sami is going to go ahead and kick it off.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate this, and I appreciate last Tuesday, 8 million people across Egypt were chanting in unison, "الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام." The people demand the overthrow of the regime. And that is the single most repeated slogan of this, what started as demonstration, it is really today a revolution, in the very true sense of the word. Now, let me give you a few remarks on the implications of that in terms of the whole Middle East, and we can then delve into them in the questions if you want to. The Middle East, since the mid-30s, every 35 years, have gone through a major metamorphosis. And the epic of that metamorphosis has always been Egypt. So if you really go back to the mid-30s, all the way till the mid-60s almost, early 60s and so on, that's the age of revolution against imperialism, against occupation, for independence, for the rise of a modern state. Then, of course, that rise and that independence and the call for development and social justice in the Middle East was faced with a tremendous resistance from the West, particularly led by the United States. And another phase started right after the War of '67 and the War of 73 and thereafter, in which the object of that in the strategic geopolitical sense of the Middle East was to reshape the Middle East into a Pax Americana Middle East. That process led us into the 1980s, into the real Pax Americana. It's very interesting to note the following. Sadat signed this peace agreement with Israel, which is the crowning of the American efforts. And then he was killed only a few months after that. Mubarak was the vice president and he ascended to power. We all know that. The point is, that treaty is what marked the age of Mubarak. Everything that has happened in the Middle East since then, what happened around the fundamental strategic shift in Egypt, which really centered on the question of how do you maintain the treaty with Israel, and how do you end maverick regimes in the area so that they come in line with the new Pax Americana. Now that thrust definitively with Egypt now is the epicenter for the Pax Americana. It and Israel and Saudi Arabia are the three pillars, particularly after 1979 and the Iranian Revolution that took place. That was the epic upon which the new Middle East was established. And what we have lived through the last 30 years all hovers around three fundamentals. One, this Pax Americana should be stable and should be maintained by any price. Two, oil. Three, financial control and political control of the region. The derivative four, which is really a corollary of the three, is any regime that we do not like, whether it is a good regime, a bad regime, a nationalistic, patriotic, or simply dictatorial, we will change it. And that is really what led the United States into the invasion in Iraq. Now, the interesting thing about this transformation, which brings us to today, is that the Egyptian military, all itself as the primo institution of the state in Egypt, has been also morphing into these phases. So after 52, for example, the Egyptian army became the protector and the defender of the nationalist aspiration for social development and justice. That is the genesis why they call it the Army of Egypt. Because the army at that time took the position, we are here to cause development, to bring justice to Egypt, and to defend our people. Later, under Sadat and Mubarak, became the national defender of Egypt. But that is exactly the point where the United States followed its historic path. We need to capture the army. Few transformations that are critical to note, which are all acting today. Transformation number one. After the treaty in Camp David, there was a commitment to have 80% of the aid to Israel committed to Egypt. So anything you hear about aid, I think we should all demand in the streets, cut the aid, cut the aid, cut the aid, because that's the end of the treaty. That treaty was signed on the basis that all of these parameters are one, i.e. continued military aid to Egypt is equal to continued military aid to Israel, is equal to the political treaty with Israel and Egypt. Second, so that is the financial and the beginning of training of the Egyptian forces. In the mid-80s, another transformation took place of very importance for today. At that time, if you remember, there was another war waged by another dictator on Iran, Saddam Hussein. Now, he was induced to that war. He was supported by the West, particularly the United States. They got into trouble. The trouble was this: in 1983, they were running out of weapons, and the United States wanted to support the weapon. The Iraqi army was totally weaponized from the Soviet Union at the time, and then later Russia. They could not rely on that anymore, so they decided this phenomenal thing about the two people who are very interesting about this is Rumsfeld and Abu Ghazala. Abu Ghazala was the Minister of Defense who worked out a secret deal which goes this way. The weapons of the Egyptian army goes to Iraq. They were all replaced by weapons from the United States with United States payment. Incidentally, the harbor of Baltimore was used secretly to transfer weapons to Egypt so that Egypt transfers weapons to Iraq. Now, and that is Rumsfeld himself, who at that time, you remember, signed the famous agreement with Saddam Hussein. On a number of issues, one of them was the weapons, and that's really the weapons. Now, today, the Egyptian army, therefore, it has the following things. It is totally trained by the Americans, funded by the Americans, equipped by the Americans, and they have strategic coordination on a regular basis with all the commands. That brings us to really what's happening in the streets of Cairo. As you recall, I mean, Mubarak, who actually tried to give in to the demonstrators at the beginning. You know, his first speech was, I'm going to change the government, I'm going to bring this. Incidentally, he changed the government, yes. What he did was, he created a military government. All the key positions in that are generals who were, or supporters of him from the military. Second, he used the army to say, we're neutral. Why? Because there are three layers in the army. The majority of the army is the army of the people, i.e. they come from the common people, they're related. You've got the caste in the middle of officers and so on. The majority of the people are sympathetic, and I believe that, but are very sympathetic to the demonstrators. Because they are also nationalists, they're also patriotic. And they also don't want to see just an army just being built for nothing else. The middle caste of officers have a slightly different interest, and their interest is to really the economic interest for the core, if you like. Because most of the army, that regime, when you talk about corruption, incidentally, there are two sides to it. There's the corruption of the top, billions of dollars, and then the corrupting influence of the civil service and the officer corps, where you give them all kinds of additional bonuses and monies and so on, just to make sure that you maintain their loyalty. So these people are, of course, scared. With a big change like this, the top echelon of the army has a slightly different interest, which is manifesting it yesterday, as a matter of fact. And that is, they are interested in one question, which is the most critical question today being fought in Egypt: the role of the army in a future democracy in Egypt. You cannot have a democracy where the army is the only arbiter of who ascends to power. You cannot have a democracy where the army decides to what degree civil society, workers and so on, can go or not go because the army likes it or doesn't like it. That's the key question being decided in the streets of Cairo today, as we speak. That's why yesterday, when Mubarak sent in his thugs for the next phase, which was, okay, now we're going to do it by February, the army stepped back. There were several reports today, if you listen to the news and so on, in which the army, young soldiers and so on, were crying near their tanks. They were actually crying near the tanks because they know their orders was, let the thugs have a free reign.
Yeah.
When that failed, and the people resisted that, now we go to the next phase. And the next phase is going to be blackout. It's happening today as we speak. The government is throwing out journalists, is taking today they were sending out people to search the buildings around Midan al-Tahrir for any camera, any person who is really taking pictures. And several reporters came in on several stations and said, we were prohibited from going in. Why? Because the next ploy is going to be this. The next ploy is, if the blockout succeeds, the army will crack down. So that is why you hear Egyptian leaders appealing to the army not to commit this national crime. This genocide that is going to be committed by the army should this other step succeed. Why? Well, because Mubarak doesn't want to leave. And as everybody was saying today in Cairo, yes, I'm going to leave, and it will be free elections and so on, if he manages to suppress the revolution. You will see demonstrations going out in July demanding he stays in power, and he's going to stay in power. That is why nobody trusts his promise that he's leaving.
Absolutely.
Okay? So that's really how much time do I have?